Let's talk about the latest news coming out about NATO and what's going on in Romania. It seems that NATO has deployed an airbase in Romania to ferry and maintain F-16s. During this conflict, we've been hearing that they're talking about sending F-16s. Not they're not going to do that right now. They're talking about this airbase in Romania. How do you see this move on the part of NATO?
Well, first of all, let's just be clear on the F-16s and what they're going to do in the war. It is not, like so many seem to want to believe, going to be a game changer. It is not going to adjust anything at all in the overall balance of power between the Ukraine side and its allies and the Russia side and its allies. It's going to add some capability to the Ukraine side, but I don't think it's going to be anywhere near what some of the advocates hope that it will be. I mean, you've got so many issues here. Number one, the F-16s in the U.S. system are part of an integrated system that has everything to do with radars, with AWACS top planes, ground radars in some cases, links to other kinds of platforms. And then, of course, very, very experienced pilots who understand not just how to fly, but how the system itself works. And, everything goes in together, this system of systems, you might want to call it. None of that is going to exist on the Ukraine side. So they're going to have individual pilots with experience flying one type of aircraft. And now they're going to be trying to find another one. And they learned on a different system as well. And now they're going to be trying to figure out a new system, figure out the English language because all this stuff is in English. So they're trying to navigate that at the same time they're trying to, literally fly for their lives. And it's just not going to make that big of a difference. There'll be some impact. It'll be something probably like with when the Storm Shadow came in, or when the HIMARS originally came in, even some of the ATACMs, it'll have an impact. They'll strike targets, but it won't have any tactical change at all on the battlefield. So that's the first issue. The second issue about whether there's going to be Ukrainian pilots flying US F-16s out of Romania into the combat zone to attack Russian targets, now you're getting into a much bigger problem. The Russians have been very clear about saying if any F-16 jets or any jets fly from anywhere to attack Russian targets, that base is going to be a legitimate target for them to respond against. And we keep thinking that Russia never means any of those things because so far Russia has not attacked anything outside of Ukraine. And I think that we're just rolling the dice of hoping that that will continue, that we could actually cross that red line too, and that Putin is bluffing, that they won't do it. I think that's a bad gamble. And I think it is a gamble. It's not even a risk because I think the chances are very high that Ukraine would do that, that Russia would do that if F-16s leave from any base outside of Ukraine. I think that base is going to be targeted.
Yeah. When you hear the other news that came out was Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia asking for a defensive line at the border with Russia and Belarus. When you put these two news together, it seems that NATO is doing something, is getting prepared. Do you feel it that they're gonna confront Russia?
There's lots of mixed signals because simultaneous with those, you have lots of other signals, especially coming out of Washington and President Biden himself, who is emphatic in saying they do not want a direct conflict with Russia. They do not want to have a fighting between our troops and their troops. But then you also have like Macron talking about sending troops in. You have other of the Baltic countries saying that, we might send some troops in. Poland has variously discussed maybe helping out in the western part, et cetera, sending trainers under whatever auspices. So it's a mixed signal. And of course, it's a mixed signal to the Russians as well, because they're saying, well, either do you want a war with us or do you not? Because if you don't, then why are you doing this? And we just keep, a lot of the agitation going on so that you can get misunderstandings or miscalculations by one party or another, which could all too easily expand into a war, whether either side wants it or not. And of course, you've had Vladimir Putin has really spent a lot of time very emphatically for months now, especially talking about, he has a nuclear doctrine. He is willing to use tactical nuclear weapons if certain thresholds known to him are ever crossed. And then I also hear so many on the Western side, especially a bunch of American commentators, let's see, General Ben Hodges is probably the worst of them. He's not the only one that says there is zero chance that Russia would ever use nuclear weapons because they know there'll be a horrific response, etc. But see, you're not paying attention to people who say that. They're not paying attention to what Putin says. He acknowledges that there will be no winners if it turns into a nuclear confrontation. But he also says we will use them if it does, and we understand what would happen. That should sober up every American. If he's aware that there would be a retaliation and a response of some sort, and yet he's still willing to use them, and he emphatically says, this is our doctrine, read it. I mean, I don't know how you could get any more clear than that, and why anyone would want to gamble with all of our futures and all of our security by trying to see how close can we get to a Russian red line on a use of nuclear weapons. What's the value of it? Because, and I mean, it's a rhetorical question. There is no value in it. There is zero chance that any of these things we're going to do is going to change the tactical dynamic on the battlefield that will allow Ukraine to win. It doesn't exist. Militarily, it just doesn't exist. And so to continue hoping that's going to be the case, all it's going to do is, in the quote best case, is get a lot more Ukrainian men killed, more Ukrainian territory lost, more Ukrainian cities turned to rubble. Why would we want to pay that price for an outcome that we can't obtain? Because it's just never going to happen. And that's so puzzling to me, why so many allegedly smart people in the West keep going down a path that cannot succeed.
Yeah. When you look at the Ukrainian attack on Sevastopol, what was the main goal of this attack on the part of Ukrainians, in your opinion?
Yeah, I've had an expert, an MIT professor, on my show, actually, Daniel Davis Deep Dive, to look exactly at that. We did it just a few days back, and I also talked privately to a former U.S. officer who works on a classified project for the U.S. government at the moment, so he can't go on the air about it. But between the two, what it appears is that the Ukraine side was trying to attack an air base that was about a couple of miles away from that beach, which was a valid military target from their perspective. Russia announced that there were 5 ATACMS missiles. They said that they shot down 4 of them, but one of them had its warhead event, they call it, over that beach, so short of the target. When these experts I've had looked at the videos that come out there, they say that it appears the most likely case scenario is that the Russians knocked down 4 of them somewhere over the ocean and never even got to shore. And that last one was hit closer to shore, and it caused the warhead to disintegrate in the air, but at a much higher altitude than if it had been targeting the beach, because the dispersion pattern was over many hundreds of meters, whereas ordinarily those things would be in a much tighter, tight circle, so as to cause more civilian casualties or troop casualties is the purpose of that. And when you look at a lot of those impacts in there, they said it doesn't look like most of the submunitions functioned the way that they were designed, because otherwise they said there would have been many hundreds of deaths. They said it would have just been just a meat market blood massacre on the beach if they had functioned properly, which implies that it was not targeted, but that it was disabled and fell off over there. Apparently, most of the warheads didn't even explode. Many of the people were killed when the shrapnel, I'm not the shrapnel, but the bomblets themselves or some of the debris from the missile hit people, because otherwise they said it would have been a much higher casualty rate. But what can also not be disputed is that the Ukraine side chose to take the risk of flying over known people on the beach, not lots of civilians. They knew that was going to be the case because it was a holiday. I mean, there ordinarily is anyway, but especially on a holiday, and especially in daylight. They did it in broad daylight as opposed to night when no one would have been on the beach. So they could have minimized the potential for civilian casualties had they wanted to, but they somehow didn't seem to be any concerned about that. Now, from the Russian perspective, they probably recognize it. I've seen some of the Russian experts talk about that very possibility that these missiles were intercepted in the air, and all of them didn't get taken out in time. But they also, many of them don't care, because they say this is an American weapon that you gave to Ukraine that killed civilians on a beach, and there's going to be repercussions for this. You've had many leaders in Russia emphatically say there will be consequences. And We don't know what that's going to be yet, but we're kind of holding our breath to find out what Russia does, because their people are extremely angry and they don't care about any of the things that I just mentioned. All they know is that an American weapon fired by Ukraine killed Russian civilians on a beach, and they want some kind of response. And if Putin doesn't do anything, then he's going to be in hot water with his people. So there's this dynamic playing out that there's so many pressures on Putin to do a lot or a little, and we'll see what he does.
Yeah. I remember when there was a conflict between Iran and Israel, I was talking with Colonel Wilkerson. He was curious about how the Russian air defense system would work in Iran if Israel attacks Iran. And from what we've seen so far, how did you find the Russian air defense system?
The Russian air defense system, especially the S-300s, S-400s, and I understand some of the S-500s are now operational, appears to be good. It's not exceptional, so some things definitely get through. I mean, you see the targets getting hit all the time now in Russia and in the occupied parts of Crimea, et cetera. So we know that a lot of things are getting through, and there's no system that's foolproof. Especially in a country as big as Russia, you can't protect everything all the time. But in areas like this in Sevastopol, which are priority targets to defend for the Russian side, like apparently all 5 of these ATACMS missiles were intercepted. None of them actually hit the airbase. So in that sense, that they're pretty good. That's not always the case, and even the best situations, even like in the best that U.S. Patriot systems ever were, there's still some things are going to get through. So nothing's foolproof, but it appears to be good and solid.
We know that during this conflict, on the part of Putin and his administration, they were trying to negotiate with the West. This is the last time they tried to do that was before the summit in Switzerland. He put some preconditions out, and but you don't see that coming from the West. You don't see this type of understanding coming from the West because as time goes by, it doesn't seem that they're in a position that they would win or they would gain some territory from Russia. And as we know, they're losing and losing big in this conflict. But when, in your opinion, when would be that moment that Putin and his administration say this patience doesn't work? Let's go get Odessa. Let's go get Nikolaev.
Yeah. I think when Vladimir Putin made his offer public the day before the Swiss conference began, I think that he was pretty clear then that this is a limited time offer. This is what we're saying now. He also said subsequently when he was in Vietnam a few days later, or a few days ago rather, that he said he expected the West to say no. He expected them to refuse this offer, so it didn't surprise him any, nor how could it have, because you can't go into this war with after close to 2.5 years now, and then just offer something on the table when they haven't accepted any previous offer and think that they're going to take it, especially when it requires them to voluntarily surrender additional territories where their troops are now occupying and defending. But I think that he's saying, look, this is your last chance to do something. There's lots of evidence that there is large Russian formations massing in some of the northern parts of the country. Southern Russia, north of Ukraine border, which and we're not clear what they're there for, what they're going to do. We don't know, if Putin's going to follow a path that just says, I'm going to keep this methodical but relatively low level pressure on the entire line of contact. Whether there's going to be a quote big arrow movement where he's going to try and push hard with a big onslaught. We just don't know, because really all those things are possible. And given the outlay of forces, both of those scenarios are actually plausible. But what is clear is that he can do it. If Putin says, I'm going to take the slow, methodical, long process, another year and a half, if need be, and just keep on grinding the Ukraine military to dust, he'll eventually succeed. I mean, it's just a problem of math. How many men do you have? What is your industrial capacity? How much ammunition do you have? How much ammunition can you get? Over time, the Western side can get more than it has now. but so is the Russian side. They just completed this deal with North Korea. They have their own industrial capacity just going through the roof, working almost 7 days a week and multiple shifts in many cases. They're still trying to expand it further. You have their air component is continuing to expand. Their drone fleets are expanding. Their electronic warfare, which is probably one of the unsung heroes from the Russian side about how they're helping on the ground. But overall, all those things are important, but the biggest one is the manpower issue. And Ukraine can never get into a war of attrition against a country with millions more men than they have. So just the battlefield dynamics and math are eventually going to get rid of Ukraine. And whether by slowly or by quickly, the chance of Russia eventually taking Odessa or Kharkiv or any number of other Mykolaiv, et cetera, is probably pretty high. So here's the cruel dynamic for the West right now, and the way I see it. The deal that Vladimir Putin put on the table before that Swiss summit is not good for the Ukraine side. It's very harsh. The conditions are significant, but they're realistic. If we ignore that, and especially give up their additional territories in those 4 oblasts that he was referring to, it's going to be bad for Ukraine today. But then they'll have a deal. They'll have the opportunity to end the killing, end the destruction, end the loss of territory, end the destruction of their cities, and they can start the process of rebuilding. Having a neutral Ukraine and a non-aligned with NATO Ukraine doesn't mean a vassal state of Russia. They still have the ability to continue to have negotiations and interaction and trade and everything else with the West. Those things can still continue on. The deal that exists right now includes keeping Odessa, so they have access to the Black Sea. If they don't take this, the likelihood is, nothing's for sure in human affairs. There's always some crazy thing that could happen, but the most likely, like 99% probability, is that given enough time, Russia will take Odessa. Ukraine will not have access to the Black Sea, and they will lose more territory, more men, et cetera, the stuff they can't really afford to lose, and the future of Ukraine will be far worse. So if they reject this, and it looks like they have already, then in a year from now, a year and a half from now, they may be pleading and begging for the opportunity to go back in time to right now and say, man, if only we had taken that. Because I think that there's plausible suggestions to say they're already thinking that about March and April 2022. The deal that Putin was offering then was a lot better than the one he's offering now because it didn't include 4 oblasts. The one that he offered in December 2021, before there's a war, actually allowed Ukraine to at least nominally be in control of everything, even the Donbass, if they gave certain autonomy and other protections to the Russian speakers in the East. All those things were on the table. Every time they do decline it, the conditions get worse. And so the longer it goes on, the worse it's going to get. And there's no plausible path for Ukraine to reverse the situation on the ground, on the tactical battlefield. And so it's irrational and, to me, immoral to continue to go down a path where we just hope that magically things change, because the Ukraine people are going to continue to be the bill payers.
Yeah. The other attack was at the same time we had attack on Sevastopol, we had a terrorist attack in Dagestan. And the other terrorist attack was before these two in Crocus in Moscow. And when you look at these terrorist attacks, how do you find the mindset behind these terrorist attacks? Do they really think that they can draw a line between Muslims, Christians, Jews in Russia? It didn't work so far. Why they're trying to do this, in your opinion?
This is a real cloudy situation because, given the history of secret wars and secret actions between the Russian/Soviet Union and the West going back many decades, well back into the Cold War, both sides sought the opportunity to cause havoc internally. And Russia has always been, especially in the modern Russian Federation, one of the things that has always been important to Moscow is to try to keep the lid on in any kind of religious divisions because of the animosity between Russia, Christians, Jews, and Muslims. because there's, obviously lots of world history of a lot of problems between those over the past. And so to try to keep a lid on the Russian Federation, it's been high priority to keep things peaceful between them. So obviously, any enemy of Russia would want to stir that up, especially from within. If they could cause internal divisions, that would be a desire of some people. I have absolutely no knowledge to know whether this is something that someone from the outside is trying to foment within Russia, whether it's just some nefarious actors within the Muslim community who want to spur something because they have their own historical grievances. That's entirely possible. It's unknown, but of course, many Russians are thinking, okay, well, the timing is really odd. First of all, with the Crocus attacks, now then these in Dagestan on the same day of what happened on the beach in Sevastopol. So for them, that they're not looking at this with an independent eye and well, let's just wait and see. I mean, that's just how people are. They're going to see connections where they want to, and because it is possible, that's just going to, I think, make peace less likely on good terms between the East and the West. But I know that Russia is very keen on it. I've been reading a lot in the Russian media that a lot of them are convinced that it is internal issues, like with this family that apparently was a part of the perpetrators. They do have some nationalistic or religious issues, whatever that they've been involved with. And there's a lot of concern about that within Moscow, and they're trying to take some issues. They're constrained, and they have to be very careful that they can't go so far as they start pressing Muslims, because then that's going to cause problems in a bunch of other portions of the Russian Federation, and they don't want to cause an uprising by their actions. But then they also simultaneously can't take too soft of an approach and allow that to fester and to rise up elsewhere if that's the case. So it's a never-ending challenge for Moscow, I think.
Yeah. We know that recently Stoltenberg was talking about decades of conflict in Ukraine. And it seems that they're thinking of Ukraine as something like Afghanistan, Iraq for decades, just continuing this conflict. And there is a new article in Bloomberg says NATO allies struggle to agree on long-term funding of Ukraine. When you put these two pictures together, in your opinion, is NATO looking for a decade war, decade conflict, or more than a decade in Ukraine, or with the current situation, the economy of Europe, the economy in the United States is not viable, is not a viable choice?
Listen, I think that what this exposes is that there are some significant differences of viewpoint within the West and within NATO specifically, in that you have the one part of them which you just described there that actually are good with and desire an ongoing decade-long conflict. Stoltenberg is one. You see the U.S. and Biden just signed this 10-year agreement with Ukraine itself, and a number of other states have bilateral agreements also going on long. With every indication, we're just going to keep going on longer. Here in less than 2 weeks, you've got the Washington summit of the NATO 75th anniversary, and there's going to be a bridge to eventual membership, et cetera. There's this belief that, yeah, we can just keep going like Afghanistan, 20 years if necessary, 10 years with even more than that, actually, with Iraq, et cetera. And sure, why not? Let's just keep going. Because for the West, no Western soldiers are getting killed. No Western cities are getting bombed. And if they have to pay some cash, that's fine, as long as it kills a lot of Russians and it eventually weakens them and keeps them on the downside. It keeps them focused down here. I think that is horrifically immoral, because it ignores the fact that while sure, no Western forces are getting attacked and cities getting destroyed, Ukrainian ones are. And why would the Ukrainian leadership want to sign up for a perpetual war with no end state involved that will permanently cause them to have to continue to just eradicate whole portions of their male population to fight a war that can't be won? I mean, it boggles my mind why they're doing that. That's one aspect of it. But there is another aspect of it, and I'm actually going to have that on my show here shortly, to where you have Donald Trump saying if he wins this election in the United States coming up in November, he's going for a negotiated settlement. You have Nigel Farage, who's now saying, I've been telling you guys for 10 years that the NATO in Ukraine is why there's war today, and we need to stop that. We need to do something different. You have Viktor Orban, you have Fico, sorry, in Slovakia. There are now starting to be more people to come out and say, hey, wait a minute, this is stupid. This doesn't help us. It doesn't help Ukraine. And they're unconcerned whether it helps Russia, but they're worried about the internal problems. And Viktor Orban has been very eloquent, even though he's taken a lot of heat, of saying, hey, this is not about, anything about Russia. This is about why would we support a war that can't be won and that does get not just Ukrainians, but he's already worried about Hungarians. Many Hungarians in the population, there's a couple 100,000. Many of them are suffering because it's war. Many of them have died in it because they've had to go fight in it, given that their national identity is with the Ukraine. So he's worried about that because he wants to get this thing over with as soon as possible. As long as you have a group like that, and especially Donald Trump, that's the biggest one. If he wins in November, everything is going to change because, good or bad, America is the pace setter for NATO. And right now, you got Biden signing this 10-year deal that he wants to go this direction. But the politics in the United States are shifting significantly against that. And if Biden loses, then you're going to see a shift in NATO because there's no way that NATO would go opposite the United States if they're seeking a negotiated settlement.
Yeah. When you look at we know that European Union together with the United States decided to send the first tranche of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine, to the pocket of military industrial complex, and then send weapons to Ukraine. And Hungary is not happy with this situation. It seems that the European Union tried to bypass Hungary's opinion on this matter. And even they were calling it a shameless act on the part of the European Union. How do you see, you talk about Serbia, you talk about Slovakia and Fico in Slovakia, Hungary, Orban, and we have Serbia as well. They're not happy with the current policy in Ukraine. And do you think that if we assume Donald Trump wins, are these people gonna get stronger within the European Union, their opinion on Ukraine, or they will continue in the same position that they have been before in minority in Europe?
Well, Viktor Orban of Hungary certainly doesn't think that's the case, that they would be weaker. That's why he actually went and flew to see Donald Trump a month or so ago. And that's why he talks about the prospect of him winning many times, because they're on the same page. They have the same view. And almost by default, if Trump wins, then those people that you just mentioned there are going to be on the upside because their views are going to match what the U.S. does and where it leads the NATO alliance. The European Union is probably a different matter, but the European Union only has so much flexibility if NATO, led by the United States, goes a different direction with this. So I think that just by necessity, others are going to come around to it because, obviously, if you put, instead of, Anthony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, and Secretary of Defense in the United States, which have been, just parroting what they're told by the president to do right now. If you get new guys in there from the Trump orbit, they'll be saying something diametrically opposed to that, and they'll be conducting diplomatic negotiations and relations with the rest of the European Union and the rest of NATO, aside from those you mentioned here, and they'll be intent to bring them along. So I think that the overwhelming flow of the trends, if Trump is elected, are going to pull people that way, whether they want to or not.
Do you think that if Trump wins, he's able to change the mindset of the cabal of these elites in Washington?
Yeah, right. That's actually a bigger challenge than may seem at first glance. You may think that, well, he is the president, he is the commander in chief. There's a lot of unilateral power that he has to direct things. He sets the foreign policy for the United States, no doubt. But there is such an opposition to his mindset, not just to him personally, but to his mentality on this issue, especially. And because there are so many who are very eager, as you talked about a second ago, to keep this war going on a long time. Because a lot of these guys, frankly, it doesn't matter right or left, Republican, Democrats, they were raised in the Cold War to hate Russia. And a lot of them, I mean, if we're just being honest, were sad when the Cold War came to an end and they lost their enemy of the Soviet Union. And now with this, they're almost jitty. Again, I'm just being honest. That's the truth of it, because now they have that enemy back, and so they can again portray Putin as the modern day Hitler. Everything's 1938. Anything besides going after Hitler's or Putin's throat is appeasement and all this kind of nonsense. Just ahistorical stuff, twisting of history to try to make it something else, intentionally getting the most emotionally laced terms you can get to try and get people to believe what they're saying, even though the evidence on the ground is, screams that there's nothing even close to being the case as it was with Hitler in 1938. They're radically, radically different. That doesn't matter to a lot of these people. Facts often don't matter. It's emotion. And they have declared that Russia and Putin is the evil empire, the modern day evil empire. And so no matter what the evidence on the ground, they'll just ignore it and they want to keep going. You get somebody like Trump in there who has already lots of emotional baggage and a lot of hatred for other reasons on top of that, then you're going to definitely have people that try to subvert him. They're going to say he's a one-term president. He doesn't even have a possibility of going beyond 4 years. So they're going to do everything they can institutionally to subvert him. And there's plenty of people who don't like that view that are in the State Department, in the Pentagon, really in all kinds of other portions of the United States government, people in and out of government, some of these think tanks. They'll do everything they can to thwart him. That's just the reality of it. And what's going to matter, we'll see how strong of a leader Trump is, because the fact is he does have substantial power as the commander in chief within the Constitution to carry things in the direction that he said he wants to. But he also had that during his first term. And we saw when he says, we are getting out of Afghanistan before I leave office. He allowed the institution to subvert that and didn't. He handed it off to Biden. Then 3 separate times, which I've covered many times in television and other written forums, 3 times he said he was going to get us out of Syria. We're still there to this day because he didn't have the strength to resist when the institution within in his own administration undercut him, many of them publicly, instead of either firing those people who were against and saying, hey, I didn't ask your opinion. I gave you an order. I said, get the troops out of Syria by this day. That's what he should have done. That would have set a much clearer signal that he means what he says. But when people see that those things worked, and that his orders both for Afghanistan and Syria were undercut, and then he didn't do anything to change it. And again, this isn't some kind of coup kind of stuff. I mean, this is out in the open. No one did anything behind closed doors, and they succeeded. So that guarantees you that if there's another Trump administration, those same forces will do everything they can to replicate that, to undercut his foreign policy there. And it's going to depend on 2 things. One, did he learn any lessons personally that as the president of the United States and commander in chief, he can give an order, not a request. And then number 2, and possibly more importantly, does he surround himself at the highest levels in his administration with people whose loyalty to his vision he knows and is clear? The less he does of that, the bigger the risk is that he's going to have a replication of what happened in his first term.
Sergei Lavrov was talking about a symmetrical response to the United States sending weapons to Ukraine recently. And after this attack on Sevastopol, he just again was talking about responding in a symmetrical or asymmetrical manner. And how do you see, if Russia wants to respond to this type of attacks on civilians, what would they do in your opinion? We know that they're not, so far they didn't show that they're interested in killing civilians in Ukraine. But here comes where this conflict is important for Russia to help the opposite side against the United States. How do you find this type of mindset on the part of Russians when it comes to this type of confrontations?
Well, Russia, and of course, this all goes to Vladimir Putin because he's the decision maker on all of these things that have to do with anything beyond the state. He has shown that he has a great deal of patience, is long suffering, and is strategic in his viewpoint. He's always looking at the medium and long term implications of anything he does, which unfortunately distinguishes him from most of the Westerners who can't look past the end of their nose and rarely think about consequences or just believing that we're so big and powerful that there won't be any no matter what. He's aware that there are limitations to his power, that there are actions he could take that might be emotionally satisfying in the near term, but that could cost him in the medium and long term. And he has thus far shown that he's not willing to sacrifice long term stability for near term emotional satisfaction. That being said, there is also a calculation. And he also, as I mentioned a minute ago, he's got some domestic challenges within his country, especially on their war hawk level, the neocon version of the Russians, who are saying we need to take a lot more action. Many voices in Russia, on the right especially, are saying the fact that we haven't hit them back, in previous things that they've done to us is just egging them on all the more. And until we do something firm and hard, they're going to keep doing it. That over time is going to be relevant to Putin, and he may calculate, that if he's afraid that the medium and long term are threatened by some of these actions, now he is going to take some response. The fact that the Russian Foreign Ministry, Ministry of Defense, and like Peskov specifically, Lavrov, if you just mentioned, have said there will be consequences to this one. That the Russian ambassador to the UN also, you see almost every level, they say there will be consequences for what happened in Sevastopol. So the question is, where would they go? I think that I've heard it put good the other day that Russia would be looking for a lateral move, not an escalatory move, which means something commensurate. And I had not seen that comment by Lavrov you just said, but it sounds like he's thinking in the same terms. They want to have something commensurate with what happened, but probably not a civilian, because that would cause an expansion, not a lateral move. But the U.S. has lots of troops in Iraq and in Syria, and Russia has forces in Syria. And there's lots of enemies over the United States in both Iraq and in Syria. You have the Yemen, the Houthis down there. You have Iran in the Middle East. Of course, Putin just got back from North Korea, just got back from Vietnam. And one can only imagine that there were some private talks that were not talked about publicly of ways that maybe he could help them that would be antithetical to American interest in the region. My gut tells me that this time Putin is going to have to do something tangible, not just theoretical or categorical. And I think that, my concern is that some of these U.S. bases in the Middle East may become targets using Russian weapons, because that would be commensurate with what we're doing. We have given Russia's enemy of Ukraine permission to use our weapons on their territory. We're doing it not just with providing the weapons, but even the technical expertise of how to fire some of these ATACMS, targeting intelligence from our assets. It's not unreasonable to suspect that Russia may do the same with some of our enemies on some of our assets in the region. And that's a risk for him, because if he maybe want to do something lateral, but depending on how we respond, it could end up being escalatory. Because America is not keen on saying tit for tat and going, well, okay, we helped this with Ukraine to hit Russia, and they now did this to us. Okay, we're even now. That almost never happens. We always act like that whatever happened was out of nowhere and unprovoked. I mean, we use that term all the time about Russia, unprovoked and unethical and unreasonable, etc. So how we would respond to that, it has to factor into how Putin makes his decisions. He's got to be thinking those things too, because he wants to have a reaction, but he also doesn't want an escalation, which could cost him more. He talks about this nuclear stuff. He certainly doesn't want to use it. He's been open about that too, but even if he wasn't, no rational thinking person would want to get into a nuclear exchange that he knows he might not survive, that his country might not survive. We don't seem to be thinking that way. I wish we would, but that is how Putin's thinking. But like I said, I think that his window of flexibility is closing to where he's not going to be able to do nothing or just rhetorical, that he may have to take some physical action. And the Middle East, whether with the Houthis, Iran, or some of these, violent extremist groups that are scattered throughout the region, suddenly coming up with Russian weapons hitting American targets. That's what I worry about.
Yeah. Considering the latest visit of Putin to North Korea, if something happens between NATO and Russia, do you think that Russia would be alone in a conventional form, fighting a conventional war as we're witnessing right now in Ukraine?
Um, North Korea, Iran, China, none of those folks want to get into a war with anybody, especially the United States. But if one is foisted upon them, uh, and especially if something starts to happen and America is seeing as being suddenly not as powerful as what everybody has assumed since 1991, after the Persian Gulf War, you can see where some people would be jumping on the bandwagon. And that is one of the things that I worry about is that this I hesitate to say myth, but this generally held belief, especially since 1991, that the United States is the most powerful military force in the history of the world, which is what President Biden said on a 60 Minutes interview in October. We are the most powerful nation in the history of the world, he says. And I think he believes that. And I think lots of other people believe that. But as I have been very clear over the last several years and things that I've written, television shows that I've been on, where I show graphically, tangibly on the ground that we are not an indefeatable force. We have some significant limitations. And a lot of them are being exposed by this war here, because our ability to manufacture and sustain combat on a conventional level with interceptor missiles, long range missiles, artillery shells, especially, and even some of our capability with some of our armored vehicles, our fighter aircraft, especially our Navy ships. We can't afford to lose a lot of these things and still maintain our combat. Like, many said that Russia probably thought this was going to be a short war. They probably thought that when they rolled tanks into Ukraine in 2022, that it was just going to terrify them, much like it did with the Hungarians in 1956, or the Czech, I think it was. The Czech Republic, or several others, when they basically had a show of force and the other side just gave in. I think that Putin probably thought that was his first choice that would happen when they had four, columns in different parts of the country rolling in, that they would surrender. Well, when that failed and the Ukrainian side didn't surrender and in fact fought incredibly bravely and hard, now it's slogged into 2.5 years and counting. But Russia recovered from that terrible tactical and strategic mistake. And now then they have the ability to go on. And if this goes on another year, another 2 years, Russia can do it. I think that he can handle domestically support. He definitely can handle it industrial and manpower. All those things seem to go forward. We can't do that. And even with Russia, it took them probably the better part of a year before they were finally able to kick in their industrial capacity into high gear to where they could now sustain the use of a lot of these artillery shells. We don't have it. At the current rate, it'll be 2025 or 2026 before we even get to about 50%, 40% of the daily needs of the Ukraine side alone. And that doesn't even replace all the stuff that we've already lost from our own inventories. And of course, now you got this issue with Israel down in fighting its war with Hamas and may expand into Lebanon, possibly within days. And that's going to be another huge spur of use of American ammunition, because Israel can't fight it without our ammunition. What are we going to do if we get sucked into a war somewhere? And if our adversaries, going back to your original question here, in the Indo-Pacific or in the Middle East or in Europe, if all of a sudden they see, America can't fight a war here because they ran out of missiles, they ran out of interceptor missiles, and now they're vulnerable. And that especially affects the U.S. Navy in any kind of a China-Taiwan scenario, because many scenarios, computer simulations that have been done at the highest levels in the United States show that within a week, some of our arsenal of missiles runs out. And now think about that for a minute. You're talking about like the U.S. Pacific Fleet And let's say that they start getting a lot of missiles and stuff from China, and let's say that our defenses are flawless. Not a single missile gets through. We shoot down everything. All of our ships stay afloat. None of the torpedoes work. None of that stuff. What happens in the second week? Because I assure you, China will not run out of missiles there because they have foreseen this from everything I've read, and they are prepared for a sustained conflict, and they can just keep the missiles coming. But when we run out of interceptor missiles, whether that's a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, all of a sudden now then the entire fleet is nothing but a sitting duck, and they can probably sink the whole bloody thing if we stay in range of it long enough. That is the risk that we run here because we can't sustain a war over time to keep the interceptors, the air defense systems working, the missile interceptors working. At the same time, we're also having our offensive stuff going to continue to maintain to sustain combat. That is the biggest Achilles heel the United States have that almost none of our policymakers are aware of. They still think it's 1991, that we can do anything we want. Nobody can stop us. We can roll forward and take anything, but they're not aware of the mundane logistical issues, the number of missiles we have, the capacity we have to maintain them over time. We are much more vulnerable strategically than almost anyone seems to recognize in this country, at least. But I doubt that many of our adversaries are unaware of this. I think that they are. And they know that initially, if there is a short, sharp war, they're probably not going to come out on top. But if there is a long, sustained war, then all of a sudden we're at great risk. And then, of course, which probably should give everybody pause, is that the day that it starts looking like we could lose, there will be a lot of people saying, we got a big nuclear inventory here. We need to pull that thing out. We can't allow our ships to all be sunk, etc. And now then you have the real possibility of a genuine global nuclear war from which everyone will lose.
Yeah. Just talking about the conflict in Taiwan, unlike what we've been witnessing in Ukraine, that NATO was capable of providing Ukraine with weapons because there was a huge land connected to Ukraine. Poland can provide them with weapons and everything. But when it comes to Taiwan, the situation is totally different. An island, and providing weapons to Taiwan, it's just impossible if China decides to attack each and everything coming to the island. And here comes the biggest fear of all of us, as we know that the conflict in Ukraine would not get to a nuclear war, but the conflict in Taiwan is much more important, much more dangerous when it comes to the conflict in nuclear war. Do you think that if something happens between NATO and China, we know that having a conventional war in Taiwan is impossible. You cannot have a conventional, as we've been witnessing in Ukraine. How do you see the possibility of having a nuclear war in Taiwan?
Yeah, let's look at that from a few different perspectives. First of all, even from the conventional side, it would just be catastrophic for the world, for the global economy. Everybody's aware of the chip making issues, et cetera, but there's even bigger issues on there. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, of course, there was all this massive sanctions put on them. That wasn't a big problem for this. It was a problem for the West, not a big problem, but a problem because of the amount of trade that they had, and especially the energy, et cetera. But they found kind of workarounds for it. The energy is now a lot more expensive that they can get, but they have it. They have access to it, which has caused ripple effects in their economy, and especially the German economy is really paid a big price for that. But in Asia, if it happens, if you tried to do the same thing to China, because they invaded Taiwan, you're talking a massive percentage of the global economy is tied to that. Who can survive that? If all of a sudden the Chinese market is taken offline, and we don't get anything either buying or selling from them when we rely on all of that stuff. I mean, this is way over more than just the chips in Taiwan, which by itself would be a massive issue here, but it would disrupt the entire global economy, and every nation on the planet would suffer as a consequence of just a conventional thing, especially if it goes on for any amount of time and we try to sanction them. I can assure you especially members of the global south, and probably a majority of those in Asia would not participate in any kind of a boycott against China because they're not going to cut their own throats because of what's going on in there. They just can't afford to. They have to keep their economies going, or they're going to have every government would have its own internal problems. So if it just stays conventional, you have this catastrophic impact economically, and to one degree or another, no matter what. Then you have also the problem on the conventional side, as I've laid out in detail, taking nuclear off the board. Let's say that everybody is sane and they don't go into the nuclear escalation, which would be completely catastrophic for everybody involved. If it stays conventional, as I just partially laid out here, we can't win. We can lose, we cannot win. And in the cost of the United States would be decades with an S, even to try to undo the damage here, because some of the simulations have showed that we lose between 200 and 700 fighter and bomber aircraft, and 2 aircraft carriers, sometimes more ships than that. And the loss of those, it would take decades to recover. I don't know where we would find the money to replace that many. And in the meantime, the image of the U.S., invulnerability militarily sinks to the bottom of the sea along with our ships. Now everybody recognizes that we have an Achilles heel, and it will take a long time to recover. So there's going to be this big gap in between now. And who are they going to be looking at? They're going to be looking at China. They're going to be looking at Russia. And now then you have North Korea and Iran not wanting to pay any attention to anything. And I don't know what they would do. That doesn't mean they're going to automatically launch into wars, but it sure means that they're not going to be paying much attention to us. So we lose in every way. And primarily, I mean, the United States, but also our allies, if there is a war between China and the United States over Taiwan.
Just before wrapping up, and to wrap up this session, do you think that if something happens, what would be the reaction on the part of Russia?
I, I think that they would be happy to just sit back and just watch us, go to war with China and hurt ourselves, and see our personnel killed, our ships sunk, our planes knocked out of the sky. That I don't think they would do anything more. They might finish what they want in Ukraine if it happened before that, for example, that war is over. But under no circumstances, I think, was Putin have any interest in going even into Western Ukraine, much less into NATO, because there's still nuclear weapons. So he's very clear on that. So he's not going to risk a nuclear confrontation, and he doesn't want to do anything to further damage his conventional power. So I think that he would be content and happy to watch NATO self-immolate against China, who I think that wouldn't need his help in either. I doubt that he would send any troops or anything else to that. So I don't think that this would be the World War III that some are thinking of, that he would take advantage of the opportunity to go west, because he doesn't have an army for it, number one. Number two, it would be absurd to try to do that, because he knows he would be biting off a perpetual insurgency against his troops, that he would have to have millions of men just to try to keep the lid on, and there's no value in that. So I don't think he would do anything but maybe go into the Dnieper River. I think that there's plausible that, but no more beyond that. And he's not going to follow our lead into more conflict that can't benefit him.